Ladies and gentlemen, please silence your phones and hush your babies. The show is about to start.
Hello everyone and welcome to our coverage of Heaven's Helpline, which is the new podcast from the New Zealand Herald that has shot to #1 in the New Zealand podcast charts and is generally causing quite the stir in the Southern Hemisphere. So if we can bring it up north of the equator and get everyone up here interested in it, that would be great. And so joining me are people that have been interviewed for this and provided background information for this project, and Peter Bleakley. So here we are, everyone. Welcome to the stage. We have Sarah Delaney from 21st Century Saints. We have Ganesh, as it says appropriately on his subtitle, who is just a Kiwi legend. And we have Peter Bleakley of the Mormon Civil War. So welcome, everyone.
Nice to be here.
No.
Yes. So what time have you had to get up in the morning, Ganesh, to be on this?
Well, at the moment it's 8 a.m, so it's a
8
very respectable time.
It's a respectable hour, but all the same, there's a 13-hour time difference at play here, and there's also several thousand miles of difference between us. So if there's any lag or any internet issues, or if Ganesh's sound isn't quite the same as everyone else's, I think we can forgive it for today. So bear with us. But so far, while we've been chatting behind the scenes, it's been a pretty stable connection. So I'm going to jump straight in because that's what we do here. And we're going to talk about Heaven's Helpline. And for everyone that's wondering what on earth is Heaven's Helpline, this is the sort of little blurb that was put out by the New Zealand Herald. It says, how far has the Mormon Church gone to cover up abuse? When journalist Murray Jones started looking into the church's finances in New Zealand, an intriguing Facebook post alerted him to a much bigger and much darker scandal. From the New Zealand Herald, Heaven's Helpline is a 6-part investigation into how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints built a system that protects its wealth and reputation and shields sexual predators from the law. And then it was published weekly from October the 17th, and it's now wrapped up being published, but it is still available to listen to. So first things first, if you haven't listened to it yet, you absolutely should. And hopefully by the end of us talking about tonight, you'll definitely want to go away and listen to it. It's this 6-part series. It's very well put together. It's not a podcast like Mormon Stories or like LDS Discussions or any of those sorts of things. It's a real investigative journalist diving into the Mormon Church and the way the church handles abuse in, how do you say it, Ganesh? Aotearoa?
Aotearoa.
Aotearoa. Aotearoa, there you go, New Zealand. We're going to get all our Maori in tonight if we can. We'll be getting all that from Ganesh. So yeah, that's what it is. So let's talk about it. I think we should start with Ganesh and asking Ganesh, what was your involvement with this project, and tell us a little bit about kind of how you view the project.
So I first got involved some years ago. Murray had been doing some work with a bit around church finances and had come to Wellington to talk to me and a couple of other people. Basically because I had been a bishop in Wellington, and he really just wanted to know what bishops did. How did they interact with the congregants? How did people in the church work together? Just how the church operated and how it looked like on the ground, because I think he really wanted to understand what it meant to be a church member in New Zealand and how that felt to the people around him. And then through the course of that, we had a number of discussions, and he came to Wellington a few times, and so we were able to flesh out that for him. And of course, that the initial stuff that he did on the finances, which was kind of related to what was happening in Australia and also in Canada, then morphed into this looking at the church in depth in terms of sexual reporting and how they dealt with difficult abuse issues. And so then the podcast kind of progressed from there. So I got a real foundational back seat to kind of what he was looking at, and also how he was kind of experiencing the church from an outsider point of view.
So you became a good sort of point of contact for him to then get a good understanding of how the church operates, and understand its sort of structures.
I hope so. I think that he saw me as somebody who really cared deeply about the church. I'm still active at church, but that I had seen the church from lots of different angles and was very, hopefully, objective about what the pros and cons were and the ways that played out in wards.
You want to be careful, Ganesh, talking to people about the pros and cons of the church as an active member. I can tell you it doesn't always end very well.
Yes, yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's all right. It's okay. You came and supported me. So, for those that don't know, Ganesh was everyone here actually was at the vigil that was held for my excommunication. Ganesh was here. He'd just flown into London that night. Is that right? Yeah.
Yep.
And it's like, all right, I'm gonna hightail it up to Reading and go stand outside in the cold and the rain to be support. So thanks for that. Sarah, you and I were contacted for this as well.
We were.
By Murray. Again, I think as individuals who are active, or I guess I still am active in the church, even though I'm not a member. That's weird. We'll get into the terminology. But at the time, I was absolutely an active attending member. And he was talking to us about what we were doing. So do you want to talk through a little bit about how that interview went? I'll put you on full screen.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons Murray wanted to talk to me is I'm an active attending member. I hold a calling as a safeguarding specialist, which is a unique calling to the UK Church, Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's not a calling that appears elsewhere in the world. And it's a calling where the role is to assist the state president to implement the safeguarding policies and practices and support with training, audits and general work around safeguarding. So Murray had become aware of the work that I had done with another now ex-member of the church, Jane Christie, that we'd use our channel 21st Century Saints podcast to talk and raise concerns about the lack of safeguarding and the lack of seriousness attention that was given to safeguarding and the harm that abuse and the lack of transparency and the problems that we were seeing in the church around abuse were causing. And we'd been doing a lot of work to bring this to the attention of the church from a campaigning activist narrative perspective to say, this is not okay. We can do better than this, and victims deserve better from us as a church. And we can support and help you to do better if you will take advice and listen to people. And the upshot of that was that we did see in June 2022 significant changes to the safeguarding policies in the church in the UK. And I think it was the backdrop of that Murray was particularly interested in, is why had we become involved in a campaign to challenge the leadership of the church and to say this is not okay, you have to do better? And how did we get to the point where the church agreed and recognised that they were failing, that they were not doing the best for victims, that they needed to up their game significantly? So we ended up having a long interview. I think Nemo and I were interviewed for quite a lengthy time by Murray, and we were able
on
to
for a
talk
few
about
hours,
all aspects.
sure.
It was several hours, it really was. Yeah. And we were able to talk in quite some depth about experiences that we had both had, well, all of us had as part of the Brit Venture Group around seeking to campaign for changes in the church in the UK.
Mm-hmm. So, Peter, as the only one who wasn't contacted by Murray, how upset are you? And then two,
I'm livid profoundly.
No, but how do you view? I mean, because I'm just riding on the coattails of 21st Century Saints. He probably wouldn't have spoken to me had I not been, tangentially involved with their work. So, I was kind of thrown in as a last-minute stand-in for Jane to attend the interview. So, I wouldn't feel too bad. Sarah was definitely the star of the show there. But what are your thoughts on this series when you saw it come out as someone who wasn't necessarily involved behind the scenes, but saw it for the first time when it sort of came out? Yeah. What were some of your initial thoughts?
When I started listening, it's just a remarkable piece of journalism that Murray has. He's a British guy. I think we've all agreed, in his 30s, and he's at the moment working in New Zealand. And it is a masterpiece just of journalism, so on that level, at least, it was astonishing to watch because he weaves a narrative. He starts to build up information, introduce you to different characters. And as he goes, he touches on so many really profound issues. But what really came across to me most is he gets it. This guy really understands what's going on here. And obviously, as we've heard, that came because he did proper research. He spent a long time talking to people until he fully understood our culture and our systems and what goes on. And I mean, it's just journalistic poetry as far as I'm concerned. You know, I can't speak highly enough of it as a listening experience, but also as a profound, powerful kind of message to back to the church itself of, you know, this stuff is, there are so many things that need fixing here and they should be obvious. And it just takes anyone speaking the truth calmly. You know, he's very chill, it's not sensationalist at all. And he also allowed people to be fully rounded human beings, rather than going for quick sort of extremist sound bites, in a way that John DeLynn has kind of pioneered with Mormon stories, allowing people time to tell their full story. And so he definitely took that approach as well, that he's not dealing with stereotypes or shallow versions of who Latter-day Saints or bishops or leaders are. And the way he constructed the mini-series of about 6 episodes also looks at things from the perspective of victims, but he also spent a lot of time looking at the experience of bishops and the clergy trying to deal with these cases, how the church does not train them well enough, and all, you know, really it's, as we're always saying, it's about systems, not people. That everyone is kind of set up by the way things are in the church for often, sadly, wonderful, naive, untrained, unpaid, unprofessional clergy leaders being right in at the deep end of the worst that humanity can do to each other. And but also what was brilliant about it is it kind of went global as well. He wove into the fact that the Arizona case that has been such a headliner actually began in New Zealand, with abuse being filmed and then being found in someone's collection in New Zealand. He identified the fact that in a few individuals, in particular one individual law enforcement officer dealing with that case, and the commitment of his team in New Zealand to go through every example of child abuse found in video form, with the hope of somehow being able to identify victims and get help to them. That ended up being the tiny thread that went back to the case in abuse in Arizona coming to light and those children being rescued from their abusive father, who 2 successive bishops in the LDS Church knew was abusing his children and were repeatedly told by the church's systems not to follow it up. So I was really pleased that he made those links with what's been going on globally on these issues. And in the last episode, he also segued into shelves breaking, faith deconstruction, how this is an interconnected kind of mess. It's not just one issue, and people's experiences dealing with all of that. And you know, I could
Can I
go
just
on,
stop you
but
there a sec,
as
Peter?
you know,
Yeah.
yes,
Can I just grab you
absolutely.
there for a sec?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned that they really researched well by chatting to people. And I want to get Ganesh's reaction to a comment, and then I want to kind of go to that point. Coco B, a name that we all recognize by now from the comments, said the creators of Heaven Helpline said Ganesh was a believing or active member, and I thought maybe they hadn't talked to Ganesh lately. But then I thought maybe he was still active. So do you want to just clarify that if you want, Ganesh?
Yes, I'm absolutely active. I go to church every week. I went to church yesterday, here in New Zealand. So yes, still active, and it's my tribe. I might not be a fully believing member in terms of the church's truth claims, but I am absolutely a defender of Mormonism as my spiritual home. So I do want it to continue. Kind of, as Peter has, been such a great example of that. I want it to continue. I want it to be as wonderful as it possibly can be, because there's no way it's going away. So it might as well be good. And I applaud all the work from the 21st century saints for making those really amazing, pushbacks that mean that change actually happens and is an inspiration for the rest of the world. In fact, a model to follow.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks.
I think that's what I would love to see more than anything, is everybody else say, this is not good enough for our country, we expect the church to do more, and to take up the fight and to say, this is what we expect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to point to what was being said by Peter about how Murray did his research really well. I think one of the ways he did his research really, really well was to talk to individuals. Was to talk to people who knew about what's going on, particularly to talk to victims. And I thought it was really interesting that the church's sort of Pacific newsroom, one of the things that they sent out on the 21st of October was, all right, well, here's some of our members talking up about why they like the church. Okay, fine, cool. Murray didn't say that there aren't members of the church that it doesn't work for, that don't enjoy things, that didn't enjoy going on missions, that don't enjoy paying tithing or any of that sort of stuff. There's this idea that if the church can just assert that all is well and that all its members really love the church, then all the problems will go away. And I think there is, of course, naturally a selection bias in who is going to speak to a reporter about problems with the church, right? Someone who has this very orthodox Mormon mentality of all is well and let us not talk about any of the problems, lest that somehow make it worse, isn't going to speak up to a New Zealand Herald reporter and say, yeah, here's the issues in the community. It's going to take someone who's in some way unhappy with how things are going in the church and therefore feels the need to speak out. So that's something I wanted to bring up, was that they will complain about the sort of people that spoke, but Ganesh, I feel like you were very fair. Yeah, go for it.
One of the things that Murray and I talked about quite a bit, and it didn't kind of make it to the podcast, but the idea, the way that church members and even church leaders are encouraged to promote the church, in fact, be defensive of its image. And one of those ways, as a priesthood leader, is that any disparity counsel, the considerations are for the victim, of course, but also for the good name of the church. That one of the things that the church is really conscious of is its public image and how that is presented. And so most members of the church have the emphasis to be able to present the church well, whether to, as President Nelson has advocated for the name of the church to be, accurate, or that, we put on a happy face for the public, that when people come to our meetings, they see people dressed well and looking, pleasant and greeting warmly. Those kinds of things are really important for the church, and it's done a number of things to make sure that that's the case. And of course, there are no mechanisms to stand up and say, I'm not happy with some things. Testimony meetings are not about people sharing their frustrations. Classes are not designed to, say, look, I'm struggling with this. So there are not, so church members themselves don't have a forum for being able to say, look, I'm really concerned about this, or anything that they might do is behind closed doors.
And the podcast showed us that with the case of Daniel Taylor, that Doug didn't feel as though he could put his hand up. It didn't even come naturally to him to put his hand up and oppose his calling as a seminary teacher, right? Because we do have that technically. I've done a lot of work to try and expose why the opposing vote system doesn't work and trying to show how it doesn't work. But there was a very signed, sealed, delivered case of it, even on a local level. You've got a guy that it's known has got problems, and in spite of Doug's reservations, they call him to a position where he has more access to children. And Doug doesn't even realize that he can oppose. Sarah, I know you're desperate to come in, so go on.
Well, I just want to I think what Ganesh said is so powerfully true and so problematic when it comes to safeguarding, that the reputation of the church is everything. And members of the church, rank and file members of the church, are taught and told and trained to never get the church, to never criticize the church, always speak positively, and to always show the church in good light. And the only thing necessary for secrecy to flourish, for abuse to flourish, is secrecy. And the best way to stop abuse being honestly addressed is a lack of transparency. And that is exactly what that system of only talk about the good things in the church brings to pass, is a lack of transparency where nobody's able to be honest. And the other thing about that, Nemo, you just touched on the opposing vote and the problems of that system. Is the UK, there was an independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in religious settings. And one of the church lawyers gave evidence to that inquiry on behalf of the church. And one of the things that he stated as a defence as to why the church at that time were not using DBS or background checks on people was that we had a system of opposing votes, and that anybody who was asked to serve in the church had their name presented to the congregation that had the opportunity to bring to the attention of leaders any reasons they thought and knew of why that person should not serve in that capacity. But as we know, that is just not something that's inbred into the membership of the church to oppose if they feel there's problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think showing how opposing votes don't work in that and every case, dishonesty and financial fraud from the leaders of the church. I mean, I probably shouldn't call it fraud on a technical basis, but financial dishonesty is what we saw come out of senior church leaders, and no one seemed willing to stand up, or very few people seemed willing to not oppose, to not sustain them, say I oppose. I was one of those people, and look where it got me. So it didn't go very well. Now, Ganesh, if everyone's wondering why I'm ignoring Peter, I'm not ignoring Peter. I'm not ignoring Sarah. I'm just enjoying the fact that we have Ganesh on the show and want to particularly speak to him about some of what's going on in New Zealand. But don't you worry, Peter will have his time. Ganesh, could you spoke about the church's public image. Could you speak to how you think that is going to be affected by this, or maybe how it has already been affected by this in New Zealand, if at all?
So there are a number of Facebook posts about these podcast episodes, both through the New Zealand Herald and online, and they generated a number of responses from church members that were worried that the church was being attacked. I mean, that's the persecution narrative that we've all grown up with, of course. Instead of actually, gosh, what are the issues that we might need to address in our own backyard? So, and I think that that's a very relatable kind of a feeling. When somebody's looking and scrutinizing you, it's easier to go, well, hang on a second, I'm a good person. The organization I belong to is good, and why aren't you highlighting this in other areas? But I think that if people actually listen to the podcast, they will find it incredibly supportive of Mormonism and the church in general, particularly at the ward level, because it really emphasizes how wonderful members are and how interested they are in being great and being responsible in their community, and really shines a light on some of the systemic failures for the members to actually be those kind of people. So I see that actually it will, as members of the church, particularly faithful, active members, they'll all listen. And the church in New Zealand is probably much like the church in the UK, and that is everybody knows everybody else. I didn't know who else was on the podcast, but I knew 95% of the people that were speaking, because that's just the way New Zealand is. There's a 1 degree of separation when it comes to the church. So either those people, or that those people's families. It's just that close. And actually, when members of the church, active and maybe even those who have departed, talk, and you hear their voices, everything that Murray has put forward is very relatable. People will hear their own concerns echoed in the voices of the people who are presented. And I think that it will be hopefully a transformative experience for members of the church in New Zealand, at least.
Well, because something that's really struck me about it was the way in which he managed to balance making this feel like his primary focus and concern was the people of New Zealand, was the members of the Church of New Zealand, while also drawing in the broader global narrative and comparing the issues in New Zealand to issues abroad. For example, talking about priest penitent privilege in New Zealand and talking about the 6-year statute of limitations on abuse cases in New Zealand, a very short statute. And, you know, hearing that the church absolutely claims that as a defense where other churches don't. Other churches don't always claim that 6 years and say, no, you know, we'll still address the problem. We'll still believe the victim. One lawyer who was speaking in defense of her clients was saying that the church essentially would re-traumatize them by being very aggressive in terms of its litigation. That was their opinion. And I can't say I would be surprised to learn that that is the case. So just before I go to Peter, or Sarah, because Sarah sounds like she wants to say something. Ganesh, can you just say what you think this will... Actually, I'll tell you what, I'll save that question. Peter, then Sarah, please. Peter, just... I don't even have to ask you a question. I just say, Peter, talk, and you will just provide me with goodness. So off you go for a minute or two. Hang on, Peter. Yeah, you are talking in like cut syllables there for a second, and I'm not the only one who's seeing it in the chat. So you're getting a real stuttering. So you're on wireless headphones, so I'll let you try and solve that in a minute. I'll jump to Sarah while you're trying to fix that. Sarah, please.
I just wanted to pick up on the comment around the church acting aggressively when it comes to dealing with victims. And the absolute classic example we saw of that was in the Arizona case, wasn't it? Where bishops had known, the church had clearly known about the abuse of these children and allowed the abuse to continue with no effort to stop it whatsoever. And then fought aggressively in the courts, probably considerable trauma to these victims, even though they'd have been adults at this time, to prevent having to pay compensation. And the church could have simply paid compensation out of more interest than they get in 1 minute on their money. And instead, they preferred to go after as aggressively as they could any action that would prevent them from having to do that. And I think that's a real example of their aggressiveness in how they want to defend, litigate. They did everything they could to hold on to the right that these priesthood holders had to not report abuse, rather than saying, you know, sorry, we got it wrong, we're going to do away with penitent privilege.
But not only that, Sarah, it's the way they declared themselves pleased with the outcome when the court ruled in their favor. It's not that, hey, we don't like this legal system, but we were on the right side of it, and so whatever. It's not even like, oh, we're pleased that our bishops aren't going to take the brunt for this and that we as an institution are absorbing it. It's just that we're pleased that we've got away with doing things the way that we want to do them.
Yeah.
And I think that
it
is so telling about the church that they care about most is being right legally, not right morally, not right ethically, but correct legally, institutionally. I'm not talking about like local members. Local members have a moral compass generally. And, you know, those bishops, as much as we can say they didn't do the right thing, they were told by their church that they trusted that it would be illegal for them to report. So they didn't report, right?
They were told by their lawyers of the church.
Were,
and one
yes,
thing I have learned, absolutely,
and they got the lawyers.
One thing I've learned over the 2 years that Jane, Christy, and I have been doing our work around safeguarding in this church, the one thing I've come to understand, and it's depressingly, painfully true, is that this church is run by lawyers. Nobody will do anything. They won't implement a policy, a practice, a procedure. They won't do anything until they have consulted with the lawyers. So who's running this church? Because from what I see, the lawyers are.
But the problem is, to that extent as well, is the next prophet of the church is going to be a lawyer, right? And they self-select for their leadership to be lawyers and businessmen. So of course it's run like a corporation. Of course it's run with extensive legal counsel. Of course their view of what's right and wrong is heavily formed by whether it's on the right side of the law or whether they can fight it legally. And it's really strange for a church. Okay, follow me through on this, and I'll get Peter in. See in the comments, see if you follow my logic here. You've got a church that wants people to believe it on the basis of how they feel, right? And they want people to follow Moroni's promise and get the feelings of the Spirit, and then that tells you that the church is true. And your actions day to day as a member of the church should be guided by your feelings, should be guided by whether you feel the Spirit or whether you have a stupor of thought or this or that. But the moment it comes to institutional decisions that affect the entire church, that paradigm goes out the window. They do not operate like that. They instead operate on the basis of not what feels right or wrong, but what is legally defensible, or what gives them the least legal exposure, or what the lawyers say, or what's good for business. All of a sudden, ethical, moral, spiritual considerations go out the window.
Yeah.
It's not run on the basis of any of those sort of inputs. And I find that just incredibly ironic. Peter, can I throw you in on that, and we'll see if everything's working for you?
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you beautifully.
Great. Good. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Yeah, and this is it's as people have already said in the comments, do what is right, let the consequence follow, was a profound, it feels like, as you said, up to a certain point, up to sort of ward level, there is one version of Mormonism going on where obviously people should have integrity, people should be honest, and we certainly in the past, before the internet informed us otherwise, we projected onto the leadership, because they claimed to be prophets and apostles of Jesus and the same religion we believed, we obviously just would by default assume they can't possibly be up to no good. It was inconceivable that they would be less moral than we are. And especially in the past, when they used to talk about how leaders had to be role models, and where much is given, much is required. Now it's all flipped on its head, that people have been carefully conditioned over the last couple of decades, and we've kind of watched it happen, that your default mode needs to be to throw out any kind of mental gymnastic excuse that pops into your head in the moment, to make excuses for the leaders doing things that are wrong. And that the religion has, rather than being a manifestation of devotion to Jesus Christ and the principles that he taught, it's become all about loyalty to the leaders at any cost, at literally any cost, at the cost of safeguarding your own children, at the cost of your family finances, at the cost of anything. The church must always come first, and its leaders must always come above any other consideration. And they literally have taught this in General Conference, as we've all been documenting in our podcasts, teaching that even thinking of leaders having human weakness is a sin you should repent of, even if they are actually weak humans. That's all in Henry B. Eyring's talk, The Power of Sustaining Faith, just a few years ago, 2006. Yeah. And no, wait, much
2016, was it not?
No, 19.
19. All right.
There we go. Like, I thought it was 18, but this is recent stuff, and lots of other examples. But this is the point: is you create a culture now where abuse will be endemic. Because when he gave that talk, he basically said, and he quoted George Buchanan saying, there is no possible scenario whereby members of the church can oppose the leaders in any way, or even criticize them, or even allow yourself to think, never mind speak, think that they might be dangerous, that they might have human weakness.
It is a sin you must repent of daily. To think of your leaders as having human weaknesses. Yeah.
And therefore, safeguarding is gone. He eviscerated safeguarding in General Conference, because if you're not allowed to hold leaders accountable, if you're not allowed to take reasonable precautions that leaders might be abusers, and Lord knows there's a long enough list of those that we already know about, that's how completely nuts it's become. It's just, I can't even get my head around it that anyone would do that. But he gets up there and he taught those things, and the first presidency enforced it, and that culture has now trickled down.
Can I throw a few comments on screen here, Peter? Colby Reddish would like to defend the reputation of lawyers and say, for the record, not all lawyers behave like the churches. It's okay, Colby, we still like you.
We're talking about church lawyers, not
Nick
lawyers.
Johnson says church lawyers are church broke.
Yeah, they're not good lawyers.
I don't
they're
even
really
think it's
bad
that.
at their job. They're terrible at their job.
Church broke. I think
Yeah.
they are simply. I think it's simply that the church is their client.
Yeah.
And so who do they have to protect? Because, I said this when Kyle S. McKay was called as church historian. I said, who have they picked for a historian? A lawyer. And what's the difference between historians and lawyers? Because they both examine facts and they both try and look at a narrative. The difference between historians and lawyers is who needs to be the hero of that narrative, is who those facts need to serve. For historians, by and large, the facts need to try and serve objectivity. And for lawyers of the variety of people like Kyle S. McKay and people that work for the church, particularly, those facts and the things that they find and the narrative all has to be in defense of their client. It all has to be in the interest of their client. So this is where, I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. If the people, or if the lawyers on the other end of the church helpline were being paid by the church, but were the bishop's lawyers, right? If when you call that helpline, you become their client, not the church, you as an individual become their client, I would be applauding this helpline. I'm sure many others would, because it's immediate legal advice that the church pays for but doesn't control, and is actually in the service of the individual who is trying to who's trying to navigate the law in what is clearly a very tricky situation. That would be a tremendous benefit, to have a lawyer on the other end of the phone as a bishop when someone brings you, because that lawyer then would go, right, what's the best thing for you as an individual right now to make sure that you do everything you're meant to do by law. And those lawyers would be trained in this area. This would be their area of expertise. They would understand exactly what those bishops can and can't do in that situation. But instead, the church is their client, and that's a problem. Ganesh, you said you know some of the people, but you looked like you had a thought there. So come in with your comment, please.
Well, I knew pretty much everybody in the podcast. Yeah. One of which was Tom Sutcliffe, who is that church lawyer who answers the helpline. So he's a state president in Hamilton, but he used to be. He grew up in Wellington. He's a very close friend. So I was very surprised to hear his voice, and I wanted to chat to him about that. What I was going to say about lawyers is actually this is baked into the foundation of this church, and by which means when you read the Book of Mormon, the lawyer rhetoric in the Book of Mormon is against lawyers. And this is because even before the Book of Mormon was written, Joseph Smith had been to court twice, in 1826 on his glass looking, and then he was by Josiah Stoll's nephew, and then in 1829 in January by Lucy Harris. So he'd been persecuted in the courts twice before he had before the Book of Mormon was put on paper, and also his father had been to court and been effectively swindled. So the rhetoric in the Book of Mormon is anti-lawyer rhetoric. But in 1838, when Joseph was facing a whole lot of legal problems in Missouri, he was kind of saved by lawyers, General Donovan, and in fact, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon became lawyers. They trained under General Donovan as lawyers, and then of course when commerce, or Nauvoo as it became, was implemented, all of those laws that were part of the charter, those reinforced things like habeas corpus, which allowed Joseph, as the municipal court judge and mayor of Nauvoo, to effect what was going on in Nauvoo for his own benefit, including dismissing cases against him because he was the judge, and because he had gone to incredible lengths with habeas corpus to utilize it for his own personal defense. And so this is the beginning of Mormonism. This is the beginning of the church, and this is baked into how the church saw its ability to survive and thrive as an organization, and it carried on right through into Utah, of course, and into the present day. So when we're talking about lawyers in the church, there is a really big distinction between what is written in the Book of Mormon and what happened in Nauvoo, and how this plays out with and I love what you're saying, Nemo, that effectively at the ward level the church is full of moral people, but at the corporate upper level it is completely dominated by a lawyer, precedent, and almost litigant kind of a scenario that invades everything that the church does at a corporate level. And I think that it's crazy, but that's what we have.
Peter raised a good point to us in the Brit Vengers chat, and I'll just summarize it, but I wanted to chat to you about it, is that Murray in this podcast did an excellent job, kind of speaking of the origins of the church, of laying out the persecution complex of the church, right? Of laying out this bizarre persecution narrative that the church has, and basically saying, yeah, I can see that when you're a small group of people going town to town, when you're a small group of people going state to state, you're running away, you end up running over the Rocky Mountains, over into, or to the bowl of the Rocky Mountains over in the west. But at what point, when you're a $260 billion corporation, can you still try and pretend to be the victim somehow?
Right.
And I think all of the churches, like the way that they reached out and responded to Murray, I don't think it's worth us even going through that response, to be honest. But it screams, "Come and understand us better. Stop persecuting us, please." So, well, you're not being persecuted. There is an issue within the church that Murray wants to address that is affecting the people of New Zealand, and it's affecting people all over the world. But he's focused on New Zealand at this point. And the church's persecution narrative just screams through the way that they're reacting to this, and the way they react to all these things. It's as though they forget that they are actively pushing for clergy penitent privilege whenever the issue comes up. They forget that they're the ones that are trying to keep those laws in place, and that they have such really strong ability to do so when that position is challenged. It's like they are their own protector, if that makes sense. They're worried that they're not going to be protected by the law that they themselves were in such a strong position to actually help right. It's kind of this bizarre sort of duality there. Sarah,
if we could let go of the persecution trauma that the church has as institutional, intergenerational trauma, if we could let go of that, and we can let go of the pride that the church have about they have to be always seen as right, and they can't possibly accept advice or guidance from anyone who is not a senior leader in the church, we would see a much stronger, healthier church that was actually able to recognize abuse, to deal with abuse, to challenge offenders and abusers, and to actually create safety for victims. Instead, what we see is an absolute mess of cover-ups, of people on the ground that really want the church to be safe, that want people to be protected, that want to see safeguarding in place. And if you talk to members of the church or state presidents down, universally, they want it to be safe and they want children to be safe. But the minute anyone above state president level gets involved, this institutional trauma, pride, and absolute arrogance that we are always right and we have nothing to learn from anybody outside our church creeps in and messes everything up.
I wonder, Sarah, whether, and this is for the whole panel, just to maybe sit with for a moment. I wonder whether the reason the church can't see the actual victims in all this is because they are so busy thinking that they are the victims of all this. The reason they can't see the fact that these children are victims, the reason they can't see the pain, they can't see it in the sense of they're aware of it cognitively. They're aware that something's happened, but they don't see it for what it is. They don't actually understand it. They don't process it. They don't take on board the weight of what it is that's happened to these people because they're too busy framing themselves in this narrative as the victims.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful name, and I think that's absolutely really food for thought and very, very well put. You've got this cognitive and heart that are going like that and missing each other, and they're just not connecting the two up together at all. And you've got a church that aren't listening to victims. That's the problem. They're not really listening to the pain and the hurt that victims are going through. And starting with the question of how do we make this better? How do we alleviate some of this distress and pain and offer justice for these victims? They're not looking at that. And like you say, if they're so busy worrying about their own reputation, how people see themselves, and wanting to make sure that nobody can criticise them, there is no room for a victim, is there? There's no room for a victim anywhere if you want to be seen as always right, because to have victims, you have to accept that somewhere along the line, something you're responsible for has failed. And the church they just cannot be humble enough to do that. They expect us to do that. I always think if the church could actually apply their own teaching about repentance to their safeguarding model, we'd see something very different.
Yeah, I mean, we could do an entire episode on ways in which the institutional church doesn't act in the ways that it expects of its sort of local members. That's an entire sort of other episode. Before I bring Peter in, I have to do the obligatory thing where I ask you all to like this video and subscribe to this channel and consider being a donor and consider sending super chats and all those cool things. Because if I don't, apparently, according to the people that tell me how YouTube works, that's not very good for me. So if you do like what we're doing here, if you've appreciated this discussion so far, consider going to the donor box link in the description, or consider sending super chats, or just liking the video. That's the best bit, just liking the video. There's also a new t-shirt out, a new Nemo t-shirt out on the store that is modeled after the chalk horses of Southwest England. So it's a pretty cool t-shirt, not gonna lie. Peter and then Sarah. Oh, hang on, Sarah, have you got a really quick one before Peter winds up?
This is flippant. I've just sent you a picture, Nemo, of the t-shirt I want. So if ever they call my church membership into question, this is the t-shirt I should be sporting, believe me.
Okay, right, all right, cool. Peter, please. Okay.
I just want to drill a bit deeper about this culture narrative, the idea that, or which I've said myself in this show, the idea that on the whole, local members are kind of these pure Christians trying to do it right, and we've all experienced care and love as a close-knit community from each other, and then things seem to go pear-shaped at higher levels. But we'd also point out that then gets reflected back, and part of the reason I keep attending church every Sunday that I can, while being a vocal critic, is I really want to fully understand what's going on the ground, how that evolves. Otherwise, you end up missing key things, key components. And what's really starting to strike me more and more is how those same people who are adorable, lovely people who come and, clear your weeds in your garden, look after you in your old age, we hope, although most of them will be gone by then. At the same time, though, they also have an extreme disconnection of empathy, which seems weird because we're constantly talking in this language of love and compassion, although, to be honest, less so than in the past. Because they've also completely normalized, and some equivalent of this gets said pretty much every Sunday, if not 10 times every Sunday, that, okay, we are here to love people and be Christ-like and so on, but can we hurry up with the second coming, please? It's the last days. The end is now. The world has gone to poo. Isn't it the next generation are going to be the last? They've been saved for the end. And endless testimonies, my children have left, and just clutching little straws of hope that there's some glimmer of spirituality still in them. But what that means is they're quite happy, as in my case, a ward boundary that has got at least 100,000 people in it, I'm sure, or probably more. And we have our average sacrament attendance of 35 people, that they've already decided they've done enough to try and evangelize those 10 million times more than thousands of people each. And they're just waiting for those people to burn and watch them burn. And there's a satirical program, a second series now here in Britain, called Everybody Burns, which is kind of based around a family in a high demand cult, which is kind of a blend of Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses and extreme evangelicals and so on. It's absolute genius. But that's the idea that this tiny little dysfunctional group are the best that God has, and everyone else can literally just burn. And we normalize that, and we normalize genocidal incidents in the scriptures, the floods, all the rest of it, as those people deserve it. And that tie that to a persecution complex. And I'm really, people in the distant communities often talk about the insider outsider in, sort of paradigm that goes on. You're either faithful and inside, or you're lost and you're apostate and you're out in the wicked world, even though the wicked world is full of very lovely functional families doing a far better of it than most of us are. But when you keep repeating that narrative all the time, that as soon as someone is causing a problem or not having this propaganda version of Mormonism with all its happiness and happy families and things, they become the enemy. They become the outsider. They become the direct threat. And so I just want to, in a sense, nuance up what we're saying here, that yes, it's a systemic problem, but it's also absolutely present in every congregation. The absolute lack of empathy, the pridefulness that we are the best God's got and we've done enough. It's time for the second coming because there's 20 of us now. And, forget all those people. We should have a stake here. As I've said before, in the 80s, we were all told, prepare for your ward to become a stake. Well, it hasn't. Most of them are shrinking back to 1970s
And we just closed
branch
4
size.
stakes.
Yeah,
And they're
yeah,
becoming
exactly.
branches, aren't they?
Yeah,
They're becoming
but
branches.
in their heads, they think they've done enough, particularly the exhausted elderly, and they almost want Jesus to come back quickly before more of their children leave. That's literally kind of the mindset going on. How desperate is that? But my point is that then creates a disconnection. That means all these people who experience abuse and report it talk about how suddenly even the local church system turns on them. They become the enemies. People rally around the leaders. They become defensive. They make excuses. They downplay the seriousness of the harm. They ignore the victims while they try to rehabilitate the offenders, which Murray brilliantly sort of navigated throughout this series, how that happens over and over again. And my other just sort of final point for the moment is that
Well, actually, let's make it your
everyone
final
knows
point. We're getting
better.
towards the hour mark.
We all know countless examples. If you've been experienced in the church and around for any length of time, and you actually ask people about it, all the stories come out. There's no stake that hasn't had a major senior person who's turned out to be a child abuser. My previous bishop did jail time for child pornography. It literally happened in our tiny little ward. But then the ripples quickly disappear and everyone is acting like none of that ever happened, really. Although obviously that helped to motivate our local stake to pioneer these improvements here in Britain, because we started to have some more savvy leadership. But it took a long time. So just, the scale of this, these people lining up to deny that we have a problem, or to say that the problem of abuse in the LDS Church is much lower than in other churches, which used to be part of the church's own publicity around this issue, it's complete nonsense. And we're seeing the Archbishop of Canterbury has just had to resign because they've got the same troubles there with the same cover-ups going on.
And we'd never see the leaders of our church resign over this. I put a short out there, and the consensus was definitely that it wouldn't happen. In the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, the church said that there'd only been 16 cases in the past, however long was it?
10 years. 10 years.
10 years, yeah. And between us, we could absolutely count up more cases than that. So that the church does not understand the scale, or does not certainly publicly acknowledge the scale of the issue within it. I've got a comment here from Sel for you, Ganesh, who's one of the channel members. And if you'd like to become a channel member, that's also a way you can support the channel. So, it's pretty cool. Do you see shrinkage in New Zealand?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, the last census data has just come out for New Zealand. I haven't shown the local information, but across the country, in the last 5 years, the church has only increased in reported members by 200 people. So the church claims 116,000 members in New Zealand, but only 54,000 people identify as Mormons in New Zealand. And I would hazard to guess that only half of those are active, And so we probably have, an actual active membership of somewhere like 20 to 25,000 people.
And sorry, how many did you say are on the books?
116,000.
116,000. Okay, interesting. Out of what, a populace of 6 million?
It's 5.5 million. So,
yeah.
and back 20 years, back 30 years, like Peter was talking about, actually, Mormon membership in New Zealand was about 3% of the overall total population, which meant that Mormons actually were well represented and incredibly popular and present in lots of things. We have a number of sports stars that are members of the church. The profile of the church in New Zealand is incredible, and the way that it has implemented, or at least the Māori population of New Zealand is highly Latter-day Saint, which means that it's got a really big presence.
And I mean, we won't get into this tonight, but it does seem that the Latter-day Saint Church is very popular amongst, sort of Pacific Islanders and that sort of demographic, both in New Zealand, in the Pacific Islands themselves, places like Tonga, Fiji, very popular in Australia amongst Samoans, Tongans, etc. So it's a big sort of culture grab there. But
it's a brown church in New Zealand. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is brown in New Zealand,
which is different to a lot of the world, right? It's normally particularly in America, it's a very white church, right? And I think that, again, without getting too much into the history of it, there's a very good reason why it was particularly a white church in a lot of the world, is because there was a ban on black members of African descent joining, or even those who had African ancestry of any kind. Subtle plug there for the book Second Class Saints. If you haven't read it yet, great book, get yourself a copy of that. But that didn't apply to islanders, to people of the Pacific. They were viewed as Haygoths people, and that was all fine. So, anyway, Sarah, and then I'll come back to Ganesh for final thoughts from him. But Sarah, what are your thoughts about what this means for the future of the church, this podcast? What effect do you think this is going to have on the church moving forward, if any? And sort of what do you see of the future of the church in this space? So
I think it will have the effect in New Zealand of many, many members saying, this is not good enough, this is unacceptable, we need to see changes, we expect to see changes, and these are the things that we want to see the church do. And I think what you will find is people will come together and start to make demands and expectations of the church, because I think people will say this just isn't okay, it's not good enough, and we're not going to sit back and let it happen. And I like to think that there is enough sense of justice in Mormons that are prepared to put their head above the parapet to speak out, that we will see people calling for changes in New Zealand and across the world. If they can implement changes in the UK, they can implement changes across the world. They just need to work out how they do it to fit with local agendas. I also think more and more we are going to see an increasing call upon people on their governments of their land, that the government start to take an interest in what faith communities and religions are doing. And that's certainly something that 21st century saints are doing through the communications we're having with members of parliament, with children's charities, with leading experts in the field, to say one of the problems we have is that you've left churches to their own device about whether they do safeguarding or whether they don't, and they have proved to you, from what we can show you in this church, they have proved that they cannot be trusted or relied upon to be transparent and honest in their safeguarding efforts. And I think we're going to see more and more people expecting government to step up and bring in some regulation and government oversight of churches and religions, which will see the LDS church screaming persecution and religious persecution as they do. But I think people will hold that line and say that's expected and necessary. And I think the other thing to sum up with is we talk a lot about the abuse helpline. We talk a lot about the failings of the church and safeguarding. If the church is serious about wanting to hear what victims have to say and victims' experiences, then they should have an independently available victim worker that victims can contact and speak to, similar to the abuse helpline, that is not beholden to the church, funded and paid for, but not beholden to the church, that they can actually speak to and talk to about abuse and their experiences. But the problem with that is people would start coming forward at a greater rate, wouldn't they? And the church aren't going to want to encourage that. But it will happen. And I think that's what needs to happen. People need to say, enough is enough. We expect more. We want the governments to act. I want you to demonstrate a real commitment to victims.
Okay. Ganesh, your sort of final thoughts. What do you think this is going to do to the church in New Zealand? What do you think this is going to do to people's view of the church in New Zealand? Like you said, it was a big part of the zeitgeist. It probably still is. You know, there's that old joke, right? Missionaries don't get messed with because gang members say, oh, my auntie's a Mormon, I'm not going to mess with them, right? So, you know, the church is pervasive in New Zealand, particularly a small population, but about the same amount of members as the church has in the UK, which has 10 times as many people. We have 10 times as many people here, but you have a similar number of members to us. So what do you think this is going to do to the church? Because it shot to #1 in the charts. It's clearly being listened to. What's your sense of that?
Well, I hope that people will first listen to it, because I think that once you listen to it, you will understand that there are some real issues that could be affected by the church. And like you said in this podcast, the church has money. It should be directing its money for the benefit of the people involved, not the other way around, not using the money to defend the church to look good. You know, and so I hope that that's a change that happens. And I know of a number of people across New Zealand who are involved who wish for that to happen. So it'll be really interesting to see if enough of them can nudge the church in that direction. And I think that this podcast gives a great mechanism to do that. And certainly what you have done in the UK, I think will be a big thing. New Zealand is incredibly connected to Britain, and we take a lot of leads from there. So I'm hopeful that we'll take up your example and make it happen.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being on. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. What I will say is one place that doesn't seem too fond of the church at the moment is Denmark. I'm hearing that Danish politicians are looking at trying to revoke some of the church's sort of religious recognition, or some of their benefits of being a religious institution in Denmark, because they are seen to be acting above the law or having a law unto themselves. I can't confirm that yet, but that's what I'll be spending this week doing. So if you want to hear what I find out about this new documentary that's just dropped in Denmark, again, about abuse in the church and the way the church handles it internally, make sure you hit the subscribe button and hit the little notification bell so you hear when that video comes out. But that won't be a live stream. That will be a researched documentary style little video type thing where I will investigate what's going on with that case in Denmark and what it looks like the church's position is going to end up being, and what it looks like the Danish government are going to end up doing to the church. Because in Norway, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses lost their recognition as a religious institution because the practice of shunning extended to children, and that was seen to be in violation of child protection laws. So the Scandis are not above revoking your sort of position as a religious institution if you're not seen to be playing by the rules. So it will be interesting to see what's going on in Denmark. If you want to see that, you know how to follow me. Thank you very much, everyone. And final message. Yep.
I was going to ask, does that mean that the Danish might revoke our use of the Christus? Will they take it?
But Torvald, they'll be like, right, you can't have Torvaldsen either. He's ours now. Yeah, very possibly. Who knows?
New logo change on the horizon.
And at that point, what will the church do? At that point, who knows? But to find out,
if we can't have Scandinavian Jesus as our hallmark of deity, I mean, we might have to go to a brown Jesus.
We might have to go to a racially correct Jesus, and I don't know what the church will do at that point. But yeah, so to find out all about that, make sure you check out my next video that's coming up. And while you're waiting for that video to come out, it would be a really good idea if you go to the link in the description and listen to Heaven's Helpline, because it's a great podcast. I'm really grateful that Murray did it. I'm grateful to have been able to help with it in some way, as Sarah and Ganesh are, and you know, Peter is also a contributor. I'm aware that Murray has listened to a lot of sort of material from all sides of the faith spectrum and from all worlds, and I'm sure Peter has been on his radar as well in that sense. So thank you very much, Murray, for turning your attention to this issue, for talking about it. And the best way to thank Murray for doing that and to hear his great reporting is to go to the link and listen to Heaven's Helpline. So do that, and then come back next week and I'll talk to you about Denmark. Have a great night, everyone. Take care. Bye.